Nobody remembered the dog's name. They just called him Lot 47, a limping German shepherd under a harsh yellow spotlight, one ruined hind leg. 7 years of service, 3 commendations, 1 bullet still lodged close to the bone, and tonight marked down like damaged furniture. Opening bid $100. The auctioneer's smile didn't reach his eyes. Silence. 90, 80, 50. A snicker from the third row. Who pays for a dog that can't even run? Rex's tail stopped moving. He didn't understand money. He understood rooms that turned cold. The gavel rose. Somebody near the exit muttered, "They'll just put him down after this anyway." For the first time in his career, Rex backed away from the light. Then the back door creaked. Rain hissed in from the parking lot. A man stepped inside, cap low, jacket soaked, gaze locked on the trembling K9. He didn't sit. He didn't speak. He just watched. Last call, $30. The crowd shifted, already bored. The gavel started to fall. One hand went up. No one knew the stranger. No one knew why his eyes shone when he saw the scars. No one knew that a different dog had died in his arms on a foreign roadside years ago, or that he had sworn never to do this again. $30, 1 signature, 1 leash passed from a disinterested clerk to a quiet pair of hands. 72 hours from that moment, gunshots would echo through a storm, beaten cabin. A security camera would capture a crippled K9 charging straight into danger. And one frame, just one, would send this forgotten dog's name around the world. This is how Rex went from unsold property to the last line between life and death. Stay, you need to see what he does next. You will never forget. The hall smelled of dust and regret. A long rectangular room with faded flags, crooked plaques and rows of scarred wooden benches that had seen better crowds and kinder decisions. Cold November air slipped through the half-open door at the back, riding in with the distant hiss of passing traffic and the steady tap of rain beginning to find the roof. Fluorescent tubes buzzed overhead, but the only true light came from a single harsh spotlight that pinned a limping German shepherd in the center of the floor like evidence in a trial. That was Rex, once the pride of the Riverside K9 unit, now standing on dull concrete that echoed every uncertain step. 7 years on the force, multiple commendations, a hind leg shattered when he threw himself between a pistol and Officer James Carter during a drug bust, gone wrong in a narrow alley. The bullet had torn through muscle, splintered bone, and left metal fragments that the surgeons could not safely remove. Rehab had given Rex movement, but not speed, and the department files listed him now in a colder way. Retired, limited, reassigned property. Unwanted, unfit for patrol. His coat, once brushed daily, had lost its shine. Patches clumped where bandages had rubbed, and a faint scar tracked along his flank like a pale river. One rear leg trembled each time he shifted weight, muscles straining to hold a stance that used to feel effortless. His eyes swept the benches, searching the faces, pausing on every uniform and every familiar haircut, hoping for one person who had always called him partner. None came. James had promised to fight for him, to take him home, to keep him away from cages and cold floor. Policy, budgets, liability memos, and closed-door meetings had settled the matter instead. The chief signed forms. The city clerk updated inventory. Someone at a desk typed his badge number into a surplus list and wrote one new word beside it: auction. Now Rex stood beneath that flickering light while strangers craned their necks and adjusted jackets, more curious about the paperwork than the dog whose heartbeat thudded against his ribs. The auctioneer, a thin man with a practiced grin, tapped his microphone and raised a hand toward the German shepherd. "Lot 47, he announced, voice echoing off the walls. Former police K9, trained in narcotics detection. Obedient, loyal, slight limp. A few heads tilted, not in respect but calculation. A woman in a denim jacket whispered to the man beside her, lips barely moving. "Slight limp means constant vet bills," he smirked. "More trouble than he's worth." A guy near the aisle shrugged. "Can't track, can't run. Might as well adopt a couch." Soft chuckles rippled through the first rows, thin and dismissive, while Rex's ears twitched at the sound without knowing the words. The auctioneer lifted his gavel. "We'll start at $100, he declared. This is a trained working dog, folk. 100 to open. Silence stretched. Chairs creaked. Someone coughed into a sleeve. A cell phone buzzed quietly as a bored bidder checked messages instead of raising a paddle. Rex shifted his weight, his injured leg wobbling, nails scraping lightly as he tried to square his stance the way Carter had taught him. The man with the gavel cleared his throat. 90, he tried. Nothing. 80. His smile thinned, professional patience frayed. A teenager in the back muttered just loud enough for a few people to hear. "You'd have to pay me to take that dog." A small knot of laughter rose and faded. Rex's head dipped a fraction, ears flattening, tail slowing until it hung still. He did not grasp currency, or budgets, or medical estimates. What he understood was tone. Rooms that warmed when he entered a school demonstration, applause when he found drugs hidden under car seats, grateful hands on his collar after a search and rescue ended with a crying child. Tonight the room felt different, colder, like the back hallway of the clinic where he had once waited alone between surgeries. The auctioneer dropped again. 70, 60, 40. Each new number sounded smaller, like the walls closing in. The phrases drifted around the benches. "He's past his prime. Look at that leg. You'd be crazy to take that on." No paddle lifted. No voice stepped up to claim the dog whose picture still hung in the precinct hallway next to seized weapons and framed commendation. Outside, the rain intensified, pattering first against the metal roof, then building to a steady drumbeat that seeped into the room through every crack and frame. The cold wind slipped along the floor and wrapped around Rex's pores, carrying the smell of wet asphalt and exhaust. The same scent that had always meant deployment and sirens. Now it meant something else entirely. The auctioneer glanced at a clipboard, then back at the thin crowd. "Folks, this animal has thousands of dollars of training behind him," he insisted. Sales pitch hardening. He follows commands. He alerts on narcotics. He's housebroken. He just needs a quieter life. A man in a faded cap shook his head. Quieter life still costs food and medicine. Another voice chimed in. "Shelters full of younger dogs for free." The words landed like small stones. Rex's breathing quickened. His gaze kept flicking toward the doorway, waiting for a familiar silhouette that never appeared. The handler who had once slept on a kennel floor after surgery, whispering, "Hang on, buddy, I've got you," was now absent, locked outside this moment by department rules and a signed separation form. Inside, the auctioneer sighed. $30, he said finally, resignation creeping into his tone. Final reduction, 30 to take him home. The number floated there, an insult disguised as opportunity. A couple near the aisle exchanged a glance, then looked away. A man at the back shook his head and returned to scrolling his phone. The room buzzed with quiet conversations, all of them about money, inconvenience, risk, none of them about the dog. Rex stood alone under that tired light, legs shaking harder now, breath fogging faintly in the chilly air, listening to voices that had nothing to do with commands or praise. In the distance, thunder rolled, low and warning. The storm that would soon hammer a remote cabin in the hills was gathering its strength over the town, stitching dark clouds together, while this small, cruel pause played out below. A droplet slipped from the leaking ceiling and landed near Rex's paw, exploding into a tiny star of water that spread and vanished into the concrete. He blinked once, eyes glossy, chest tight with a feeling he could not name but felt deep in the place where training ended, and instinct lit. He lowered his head, not in submission to a command, but under the weight of being left behind. The auctioneer lifted the gavel again, ready to close the file on lot 47, with a single tap. In his mind, the evening was almost over. In Rex's world, it felt like everything. Outside, the rain kept falling, the same gathering storm that would soon slam into a dark cabin far away. Sirens had been the soundtrack of Rex's working life, a rising wail that once promised purpose instead of endings. He did not begin as a legend. He arrived at the training yard as a restless pup with sharp eyes and no brakes, dragging handlers across gravel, lunging at every shadow. Instructors saw raw drive wrapped in chaos and went to work. Short commands, whistles, endless repetition, sit, down, heel, track, bite, release. Every correct move brought a tug toy, a tossed ball, a rough hand on his neck, and a low "good boy." The clutter in his mind slowly organized itself around tasks. He stopped chasing butterflies and started chasing odor, following invisible trails across fields and through obstacle courses, climbing walls, crawling under boards, racing through tunnels. He discovered that listening always led to a clear job at the end. By the time he finished the advanced course, the goofy pup had hardened into a focused canine who lived for the next order. That was when Officer James Carter came looking for a partner. He was in his 30s, uniform creased, jaw rough with stubble, eyes carrying too many late shifts. He had buried one partner, watched others transfer away, and had no interest in a mascot. He wanted loyalty that would not walk out. During a demonstration, the instructor unclipped Rex's lead and pointed him at a row of lockers. The dog flowed across the ground, nose sweeping cool metal until he stopped, sat, and fixed on one door that hid a packet of narcotics. No fidgeting, no glance back, just quiet certainty. James felt something in his chest unknot. Later that day, a form slid across a desk, and two names ended up side by side, Officer James Carter and Canine Rex. From then on, their mornings ran on habit. Before dawn, boots crossed James's hallway, keys tapped his belt, and the kennel door opened to a German shepherd already standing. "Ready, boy?" James would ask. Rex answered with one controlled tail wag and steady eyes. The patrol car carried them into tired headlights and neon glare while calls crackled over the radio. Fights, break-ins, overdoses, missing kids. They cleared stash apartments that stank of chemicals, checked abandoned cars cooling on the roadside, and swept school corridors after threats turned normal days into lockdowns. Rex found drugs under sinks, pills buried in gardens, guns wedged in ceiling tiles. Every success ended the same way, with a quick word, a rough hand in his fur, and a battered ball tossed as payment. After the worst calls, break-ins, James sometimes sat on the station steps, staring at the parking lot lights, and Rex leaned against his leg until his breathing slowed. Their bond grew there, in silence, more than in any headline. Then came the night that split their timeline. Clouds sagged low over the industrial district, pressing the city under a dark lid. Rain slicked the streets and smeared the red-blue glow of patrol lights into trembling streaks on the cruiser windshield. Dispatch crackled with tight urgency, calling units to a suspected drug warehouse, with multiple armed subjects, and a shipment moving through the loading bay. James tightened his grip on the steering wheel and glanced at the mirror. Rex stood balanced in the back, ears pricked, waiting. "Stay close, partner," James muttered. He did not need to say more. At the loading dock, officers clustered near a rusted metal door, while thunder rolled overhead. The sergeant outlined the plan in short, familiar phrases. Entry team clears the floor, cover units watch the exits, James and Rex sweep the loading area, and any trucks for hidden product. The door went up with a shriek. Damp air rolled out carrying the smell of exhaust, chemical residue, and stale sweat. Flashlights sliced through dust. Police. Voices shouted. Hands up. Boots hammered concrete. Radios barked overlapping code. James unclipped Rex's leash. Search. The dog surged forward, nose low, weaving between pallets, sniffing along stacked crates, ignoring scurrying rats and dripping pipes. Near the back corner he stopped, sat hard, and stared at a shrink-wrapped stack, body taut. James's pulse jumped. "We have something," he called, signaling another officer. They had barely started cutting plastic when a side door at the far end burst open and three figures rushed through, one arm already lifting, pistol muzzle catching a stray bee. For a heartbeat everything narrowed to that dark circle aimed at James's chest. Training told Rex to hold for the next command. Loyalty refused. He launched. The shot cracked through the warehouse. Fire tore through his hind leg, but momentum carried him into the gunman's torso. Jaws clamped on the man's forearm and drove it down. A second round went wild into the rafters instead of into a human body. Chaos followed. Officers shouted. Shots boomed. Suspects dropped or were shoved to the ground while James returned fire in short, practiced bursts, driving weapons from hands until they skidded across concrete and cuffs, snapped around wrists. Echoes faded beneath the steady hammer of rain on the roof. In the ringing quiet, James heard a low, strained sound, not fear, determination cracking under pain. He spun and saw Rex half down, hindquarters dragging, one leg twisted at an angle no joint should reach. Blood pooled under him, dark and spreading, turning dust into mud. The shredded sleeve of the gunman's jacket hung from his jaws for one stubborn heartbeat before he finally let go. "Rex," James said, sliding across the slick floor and dropping to his knees. His hands hovered an instant before pressing against the wound. Warm blood flooded his fingers. Rex's eyes locked on his, pupils wide, breath harsh but controlled, refusing to whine. Someone called for medics over the radio. Sirens rose again outside, ambulance and fire pushing through the storm toward the warehouse. Medics worked around James with practiced speed, wrapping bandages, securing lines, tightening a tourniquet. They lifted Rex onto a stretcher that looked small against his powerful frame. As they rolled him away, his gaze never left James's face until swinging doors cut his view. Surgery, plates, pins, and days of guarded updates followed. Best case, the vets said, the leg would carry him on walks and maybe short runs. The explosive charges, leaps and tackles that defined street work would shatter the repair. The department boiled that truth down into one cold label: non-deployable. Medically retired. Policy labeled him surplus. James begged to take him home, ready to sign waivers and pay every bill, but the chief pointed at regulations and the answer stayed no. Rex left the clinic for a kennel for retired dogs. Each morning, as pale light touched the precinct roof, he forced himself up on stiff legs and limped to the fence, facing the station doors. Patrol cars started in a row. Somewhere among them James climbed into a cruiser with an empty back seat. Behind the chain link, Rex watched every opening, muscles tensing, whenever a figure stepped out with a familiar stride. No handler appeared, no leash snapped onto his collar. Ready, boy, never came. Still he waited, because everything he knew lived in one rule: hold your post until someone you trust tells you the job is done. James Carter stood in the very back of the auction hall, half hidden behind a crooked support beam where the light thinned and the dust in the air looked like drifting ash. He had parked 2 blocks away, left his patrol jacket on the passenger seat, and walked in through the side entrance with his cap pulled low, hoping no one from the department would recognize him. He was not listed on the roster for this event, had signed no form, had received no invitation. Yet something heavier than duty had dragged him here the moment he heard the words "canine surplus" in a casual hallway conversation. Officially, this was just another asset disposal night, another quiet administrative errand where desks cleared old inventory and the city reclaimed a few dollars from things it no longer needed. Unofficially for James, it felt like a funeral without a casket. From his vantage point, he could see the entire room. Long wooden benches scarred by years of nervous tapping, the cheap podium, the flickering spotlight straining to stay steady, and at the center of it all, Rex. The German Shepherd stood with his usual squared shoulders, but a slight tremor shook his injured leg each time he shifted. To anyone else, he looked like a broken tool, some outdated piece of equipment waiting for a final price tag. To James, he was the partner who had dragged him out of darkness, the reason he had a pulse and a badge instead of a name on a stone wall. He watched as strangers leaned forward, not in admiration, but in calculation. Their gazes skimmed past the scar on Rex's flank, past the cloudy patch near one eye, past the tension in his jaw, and settled on the limp. That was what they saw, a problem, not a history. When the auctioneer's voice rang out, sharp against the murmur, James felt his fists tighten around the edges of his pockets. Former police canine, the man called, trained in narcotics detection, loyal, obedient, slight limp. The phrase hung in the air like a bad joke. Slight limp. That limp was a bullet that should have gone through human flesh. That limp was a split second when Rex had moved before any command, placing muscle and bone between a gun barrel and James's chest. Every time the dog shifted under the spotlight, the memory replayed. The warehouse, the shot, the moment warm blood soaked his hands while sirens wailed somewhere beyond the ringing in his ears. Laughter snapped him back. A man in the second row chuckled and shook his head, muttering something about vet bills. Another voice floated up from the left side, suggesting you would have to pay someone to take a dog that could not even run. The comments rolled over the benches in ugly little waves. From the shadows, James saw the exact instant Rex's ears dropped. Not in response to a command, not because someone had told him to lie down, but because rooms had temperature, and this one had just gone cold. The dog's tail slowed, then stilled, his head dipped a fraction. That tiny movement hurt more than any scar on James's body. He had seen his partner stand steady in gunfire, push through exploding flashbangs, ignore screaming suspects and crashing glass. He had seen him fearless in chaos. Here, surrounded by bored strangers and numbers, Rex looked lost. James's chest burned, a hot, raw ache that started under his sternum and climbed into his throat. This was not how it was supposed to go. When he had begged the chief to let him take Rex home, he had imagined a yard, long walks, slow mornings where the only siren was the kettle on the stove. Instead, policy had spoken like a locked door. Liability, regulations, precedent, all the heavy words that never had to look into a dog's eyes. Now that same dog stood under a harsh beam while a man with a gavel tried to convince a room that a once heroic life was worth a fraction of a weekend shopping trip. Starting bid $100, the auctioneer announced. Silence answered. James felt his jaw clench. The number dropped. 90, 80, 50. Each reduction felt like someone erasing a line from Rex's service record, wiping away nights spent tracking through swamps, days spent searching school lockers so kids could feel safe, early mornings comforting families who had just been told their worst fears. Then he heard it. 30, the auctioneer said at last. $30. A laugh rippled across the front bench. Cheaper than a new TV, someone scoffed. Another voice chimed in about useless old gear. From where he stood, James looked past them and locked on the dog he knew better than any human partner. He saw the way Rex's paws edged backward, barely an inch, as if some instinct told him that this kind of attention was wrong. He saw the way his eyes kept flicking toward the door, still hoping that the silhouette he trusted more than any sound would appear. James swallowed hard. He knew he should have left before this started. Supervisors had made themselves clear. The department could not show favorite. Fallen officers received ceremonies, folded flags and bagpipes. Retired canines, when not adopted immediately, became lines on spreadsheets. He was expected to accept that, move on, train with someone new. Instead, he had snuck in like a guilty witness, watching a scene he had silently allowed by walking away when the forms were signed. The shame tasted metallic on his tongue. In his head, words formed that he could never say out loud over a microphone or in a meeting. I failed you, but I fought the wrong way. I stopped pushing. I let them turn you into property. The guilt sat heavy on his shoulders, heavier than body armor. He wanted to shout, to step out of the shadows, to tell every person here that the animal under that spotlight had done more for this city than most of them ever would. He wanted to throw cash on the table, rip up every policy memo, walk Rex straight through the doors and never look back. Yet his feet did not move. Years of training, habit, and fear of consequences nailed him to the concrete. All he could do was stand, fists clenched so tightly his knuckles ached, watching his partner's worth sink to a number that barely covered a tank of gas. If your chest tightens watching this unfold, if the idea of a hero reduced to a bargain breaks something quietly inside you, I want you to tap that screen right now. Every single like is more than a button. It is a message sent up the chain to every platform that people still care about stories like this, that loyalty, sacrifice, and second chances matter more than paperwork and price tags. Keep your eyes on Rex, because this is not where his journey ends. The twist that is coming will flip this moment on its head and prove that one discarded life can still change everything for everyone in this room, and far beyond it tonight. Rain pounded the thin roof of the auction hall, turning every pause in the auctioneer's voice into a drumbeat. Wind slid through the half-open rear door, sharp and cold, dragging the smell of wet pavement across the scuffed concrete and toward the harsh cone of light where Rex stood, leg trembling, ears low. The crowd had already decided what he was worth. People checked phones, tugged zippers, murmured about getting home before the storm got worse. The man at the podium forced another smile that did not reach his eyes. $30, he called, raising the gavel. Last call on lot 47. Former police K9. The words floated over the benches like a verdict. Near the back, the door creaked wider with a tired groan. Rain hissed against the metal frame as a figure slipped inside, shutting out the worst of the wind with a quiet push. Ethan Hale paused just past the threshold, letting his eyes adjust. His cap was pulled low, brim dripping. Water ran down the collar of his dark jacket and traced cold lines along his spine. His jeans clung damp to his legs, boots leaving faint wet prints as he moved along the wall, staying out of the brightest patches of light by instinct. Years earlier he had walked into too many rooms where the air felt like this, heavy and waiting. Different country, different uniform, same tightness in the chest. Afghanistan had taught him how quickly an ordinary moment could tilt into disaster. As a combat medic he had spent nights kneeling in dust and diesel fumes, hands buried in torn uniforms, counting seconds as he tried to keep fading pulses alive. He had also spent long patrols with a canine pressed against his leg, a dog named Blaze, whose nose found buried explosives before human eyes ever saw the tripwires. Blaze had been fearless and precise, weaving through alleys and fields, tail low, attention locked on scent. Ethan had trusted that dog more than any piece of armor. On a blistering afternoon, that trust had been paid for in blood. The street had gone too quiet, shop doors half open, heat hanging wrong in the air. Blaze had stiffened, pulled hard against the harness, chest low, growl barely audible. Ethan had started to shout a warning when the road erupted. When he came back to himself, his ears rang, and the sky looked like it had been smeared with chalk. Blaze lay near the crater, harness torn, body still. Ethan's hands, so practiced at rebuilding broken bodies, had been useless. He held his partner until other medics dragged him away, and afterward he swore he would never let a dog into his heart like that again. Too much had been buried in too many places. Years later, a small flyer in a grocery store window mentioned retired canines and surplus equipment. He had meant to ignore it. Yet here he was, standing in a drafty hall while a man tried to sell a limping German shepherd like outdated gear. Ethan's gaze finally settled on Rex. The dog's coat, once glossy, had a tired sheen under the harsh light. A scar cut along his flank. One hind leg trembled with every effort to stay upright. His tail hung motionless. His eyes drifted from face to face, pausing on uniforms, then sliding away when no one stepped forward. Ethan saw the moment those eyes dulled. The instant hope backed up just a little deeper into the dog's chest. Something inside Ethan shifted, a small crack in a wall he had trusted for years. This one knows, he thought. This one has stood on the edge too. As if sensing the change, Rex's gaze slid toward the back. Their eyes met across the bench. For a heartbeat the storm faded, and the murmurs in the hall blurred. Ethan did not see a bargain or a problem. He saw a working dog trying to stand tall while the world turned away. The pressure behind his ribs changed shape. Blaze's last day and this shivering animal, under a spotlight, tangled together in his mind, until he could not separate them. On the platform, the auctioneer glanced at the clock, then at the restless crowd. $30, he repeated, impatience creeping into his tone. Last call. The phrase landed like a closing door. Ethan knew the weight behind words like that. He had heard them in emergency rooms when options ran out. He felt his jaw tighten. Before doubt could whisper, he stepped away from the wall and walked down the side aisle. The wet slap of his boots on concrete drew a few curious looks. Conversations faltered. Someone muttered, "About time somebody put that poor thing out of its misery." Another voice wondered who would be foolish enough to take on a crippled dog. Ethan did not. Rex tracked his approach, ears lifting a fraction, muscles tense. Ethan stopped where the edge of the spotlight brushed his shoulders and pushed his cap back just enough to show his face. His voice came out steady, low but clear. "I'll take him," he said. The sentence cut through the room. For a second no one moved. Then whispers burst up from the benches like steam. "He's serious. Must be crazy. Wait until he sees the vet bills." The auctioneer blinked, surprise flickering across his features, before habit took over. "Sold," he announced, bringing the gavel down with a crack that sounded sharp even under the roar of the rain. He gestured toward the side table. Ethan stepped up, pulled a worn wallet from his pocket, and counted out the cash without hesitation. The clerk examined the bills, nodded once and slid a short form toward him. Ethan signed his name with quick, efficient strokes, the way he had filled out charts and discharge papers for years. When the pen left the page, the clerk reached under the table and produced a standard-issue leather leash. It lay coiled in the clerk's hand, ordinary and weighty. Ethan took it, thumb brushing the familiar smoothness, near the clasp. For a moment memory tried to drag him backward to another harness, another dog, another road. He acknowledged the sting, then let it pass. Tonight was not about ghosts. He turned from the table and faced Rex. The dog's posture had changed in small but telling ways. His head was high, his ears had inched forward. His eyes stayed locked on the man holding the leash, rather than scanning the room for someone who was never coming. The people on the benches leaned in, curious, doubtful, waiting for the injured canine to balk or bare his teeth. Ethan approached slowly, matching his pace to the dog's tension. He stopped just within reach, and lowered himself into a loose crouch that brought his gaze level with Rex's. The whole noise thinned around. Ethan extended his hand, palm open, fingers relaxed, leash hanging slack from his other fist. No sharp commands, no coaxing, just an invitation, and a question he did not speak out loud. "Do you want to come with me?" Rex's nostrils flared as he drew in the stranger's scent. Rain, old coffee, disinfectant, tired fabric, and underneath it a familiar edge of adrenaline, the kind that clung to people who had seen more than they ever talked about. For a heartbeat he hesitated, weight rocking slightly. Then he limped forward. Each step was careful, the damaged leg dragging just enough to show the effort it cost. When he reached Ethan, he did not sit or bark. He lowered his head and pressed his skull firmly into the open palm, leaning into the contact as if he had been waiting for this exact shape of hand. His whole life. Ethan's fingers slid into thick fur, feeling the uneven ridges of scars hidden under the coat. Heat pricked behind his eyes, surprising and sharp. He had sworn he would never let a dog get this close again, yet in that instant, the vow felt small compared to the quiet, fierce trust being offered to him, without a single word. The hall, the benches, the whispers all blurred to nothing. For the first time in years, Ethan did not feel like a man standing on the edge of old explosions. He felt like someone stepping into a new mission. He clipped the leash gently to Rex's collar. The metal clicked, a small sound swallowed by the storm, but between them it might as well have been a promise. Rex did not flinch. He stayed pressed against Ethan's hand, tail giving one hesitant, unmistakable whack. Whatever lay waiting in the dark beyond this building, they would walk into it together. Rain hammered the cabin roof like fists, each impact shaking dust from the rafters and turning the single metal chimney into a hollow drum that echoed through the small room. 3 nights had passed since Ethan Hale had walked Rex out of the auction hall, and already the dog had learned the rhythm of this remote place in the woods, crackle of the fireplace, whisper of tall pines, old boards sighing under every step. The cabin sat at the end of a muddy road. No one drove by accident, surrounded by dark tree trunks and dripping branches that blocked even the faint glow of the distant town. Power lines out front swayed and groaned in the wind until, an hour ago, they finally gave up and the lights snapped off, leaving only the fire to shove back the black. Inside, the air smelled of smoke, wet wool, and the faint antiseptic trace of the ointment Ethan had rubbed into the scar on Rex's hind leg earlier that evening. The German shepherd lay stretched on a threadbare rug near the hearth, muzzle on his paws, injured leg extended so the muscles would not lock. Each slow breath made his ribs rise and fall in an easy rhythm, the kind of deep, even breathing that only came when he felt safe. Orange light slid over his coat and picked out the pale line of the old bullet track along his flank. Ethan sat sideways in a battered armchair close to the fire, boots off, a folded blanket around his shoulders, watching embers shift and fall. On the crate beside him lay a flashlight, his phone with no signal, and a small first aid kit he kept habitually close. The storm outside roared and hissed, but in here the crackle of wood almost turned it into background noise. He let his eyes close for a moment, listening, the way he had in tents and bunkers and half-collapsed buildings on the other side of the world. Years of patrols had trained his ears to separate harmless from dangerous without conscious effort. Tonight, fatigue tried to blunt that edge. Rex's instincts stayed sharp. His ears twitched before Ethan's brain caught the change. Beneath the steady roar of rain and the occasional groan of swaying trees came a new sound, weight on wet gravel, a sequence of dull crunches moving up the short path from the road to the porch. Not the heavy stride of a neighbor, there were no neighbors here, not the tentative shuffle of a lost hiker. The storm would have driven any wanderer to shelter hours ago. These steps came with purpose. Rex lifted his head, nostrils flaring as he tasted an unfamiliar scent in the draft under the door. The fur along his spine rose in a slow line as he pushed himself up, favoring his injured leg but making no sound. Ethan's eyes opened to the low rumble starting in the dog's chest. He slid the blanket aside and reached instinctively for the flashlight, with one hand and the drawer under the crate with the other, fingers brushing the cold metal of an old pistol. Before he could draw it, the doorknob rattled hard. A heartbeat later, wood splintered with a violent crack. The door flew inward, slamming against the interior wall so hard the frame shook. Rain slashed through the opening, carried on a knife-edge gust that blew ash from the hearth and sent sparks swirling. Two figures surged through the shattered doorway, silhouettes jagged against the lightning flash outside. Their faces were covered with dark fabric pulled up to their cheekbones, eyes visible but hard to read in the flickering light. One held a crowbar already raised, its hooked end shining in the glow from the fire. The other gripped a short metal bar wrapped in tape, heavy enough to break bone. They moved with the twitchy confidence of people who had done this before and not been stopped. Their gazes swept the room in quick, hungry arcs, pausing only long enough to count valuables. "Don't do anything stupid," the man with the crowbar said, voice muffled by the cloth over his mouth. Ethan slowly raised his hands chest high, palms outward, letting them see he was unarmed even while his mind spun through options. Two intruders, narrow room, no phone service, one injured dog with more heart than muscle right now. Stuff could be replaced. Lives could not. "Take what you want," he replied, keeping his tone flat, steady. "There's some cash in the drawer, a laptop in the bedroom. You don't need a fight." Rex had already decided there would be one. The growl in his chest deepened, rolling through the cabin floor like distant thunder. This sound was not the controlled warning bark of a demonstration. It came from somewhere older, from alleyways filled with gun smoke, and warehouses lit by flashing red and blue. His lips peeled back just enough to bare teeth, eyes locked on the intruder with the raised crowbar. The man looked down, annoyance sharpening his expression. "Call off the dog," he snapped, taking a step toward the rug. "I don't want to hurt it, but I will." That step crossed an invisible line burned into Rex's training and his bones. Threat too close. Handler in danger, decision made. Pain flared in his bad leg as he launched, but the years spent bursting from the back of patrol cars and charging toward armed suspects carried him forward. His claws scraped briefly on the wooden floor, then dug in, converting momentum into a powerful leap. The distance between them vanished in a blink. Rex's jaws slammed shut around the man's forearm just above the wrist, teeth punching through fabric and skin with brutal precision. The crowbar flew from the intruder's grasp and clanged onto the floorboards. As he screamed, the sound pure shock and pain. Rex wrenched the arm downward, twisting with his whole body, dragging the man off balance. Blood sprayed warm against Rex's muzzle, metallic. "Get him off me." The attacker howled, stumbling. The second intruder lunged forward, swinging his taped metal bar toward the dog's ribs. Ethan moved without thinking, combat reflexes overriding caution. He drove his shoulder into the man's torso, shoving him sideways and throwing off the edge. Even deflected, the blow slammed into Rex's side and injured leg with sickening force. A dull crack echoed in the cabin, almost lost under the storm's roar. White pain exploded through Rex's body, stealing his breath. Spots danced at the edges of his vision. For a heartbeat his grip loosened. The man yanked hard, trying to tear free, but rage and instinct fused in Rex's chest. He clamped down again harder, jaw muscles burning, refusing to release the one thing anchoring the threat in place. The attacker kicked wildly, heel smashing into Rex's ribs again and again. Each impact felt like another crowbar strike, but the dog dug his claws deeper into the floor, fighting to stay upright. Ethan and the second intruder crashed into the small table, sending the flashlight spinning and the first aid kit skidding across the planks. They grappled in the cramped space between chair and hearth, trading blows, boots slipping on the wet patch where rain had blown in. Ethan caught the man's wrist, forced the weapon down, and drove a fist into his midsection. The masked figure doubled over, gasped. Ethan snatched the fallen crowbar with his free hand and swung low, cracking it against the man's knee. A harsh cry tore from behind the mask as he dropped to the floor. Panic finally sliced through the intruder, whose arms stayed trapped in Rex's jaws. "Forget it," the one on the ground rasped, scrabbling toward the door. "He's going to rip your arm off." Fear eclipsed greed. The standing man jerked backward with all his weight, and the sudden motion dragged Rex across the wet boards. His paws gouged furrows in the wood. Pain screamed through his body, but even he had limits. With one last desperate twist, the attacker tore his arm free, leaving shredded cloth and a deep, bleeding bite behind. He staggered toward the doorway, clutching the wound. Both men bolted into the storm, sliding on the soaked porch as they vanished into the darkness between the trees. Their footsteps pounded briefly on the muddy path, then dissolved into the larger roar of wind and rain. Rex stood trembling in the center of the room, sides heaving, blood darkening his coat where metal and boots had struck. He looked toward Ethan and tried to step forward, but his injured leg gave out, and his body followed, folding to the floor in a heavy collapse. The sound of it cut through Ethan sharper than any shout. He dropped the crowbar and crossed the space in a rush, falling to his knees beside the dog. Heat met his hands as he slid one arm under Rex's neck and the other beneath his chest, lifting just enough to pull him into his lap. From this close he heard the catch in every breath and felt the frantic beat of a heart that had given everything it had left. He pressed his palm over the worst bleeding, fingers steady from practice, even while his throat burned. Rex's eyes found his face, glassy yet questioning, as if he needed someone to say whether charging into danger again had been worth the price. Ethan drew him closer until the dog's head rested against his shoulder and spoke into one ear, voice low but fierce. "You're not broken," he said. "You're my hero." Red and blue flashes washed across the pines as the patrol car climbed the road. Tires hissing through puddles, siren wailing against the storm before cutting off. James Carter killed the lights, leaving only the bar pulsing on top of the cruiser, and stared for a beat at the cabin ahead. Dispatcher described it in clipped phrases. Possible home invasion, remote property, caller reporting 2 intruders fleeing on foot, dog injured, heavy bleeding. None of that explained why his stomach had twisted the moment he heard one word buried at the end of the update, the part where the dispatcher relayed what the shaken voice on the line had said. Former police K9 named Rex. The name hit him like a door slamming open inside his chest. He had grabbed the mic, requested the call, and driven faster than he should have through sheets of rain that turned the world into smeared glass. Now, with the cabin looming in the stormlight like something half-remembered from a nightmare, he stepped out into the downpour and jogged toward the front porch, one hand resting on his holster, the other lifting his radio. "Broken door," he reported, seeing splintered wood hanging crookedly from twisted hinges, signs of forced entry. Proceeding inside, he nudged the door wider with his shoulder, weapon drawn low, every sense straining. The smell hit first: smoke, wet earth, copper, and the sharp antiseptic tang of open medicine. Next came the sound of labored breathing layered over the fading crackle of the fireplace. Firelight painted the room in restless orange, throwing shadows that swung and climbed with every shift of the embers. Near the center of the floor, a man in a soaked t-shirt knelt with his back to the door, his arms wrapped around a large German shepherd, whose head rested in his lap. Blood stained the dog's side, ribs and paws, spreading in pools that had already begun to darken as they soaked into the boards. For a heartbeat, James saw only that outline, and his brain refused details because the shape was too familiar. Then the dog's ear twitched, just slightly, and reality snapped into place. Rex. The name left his mouth as little more than breath. The man turned at the sound, eyes wide in a face drawn with exhaustion and shock. He shifted just enough that James could see the tightness in his jaw, the way his hands pressed firmly yet gently against the worst wounds, fingers stained red but steady. Ethan Hale, the record in the back of James's mind, supplied, the stranger who had walked out of the hall with Rex 3 nights ago. Right now, labels meant nothing. All that mattered was the dog lying between them. James holstered his weapon and crossed the remaining distance in 3 long strides, boots slipping slightly on the wet planks. He dropped to one knee on the other side of Rex, the heat of the dog's body seeping through his uniform even as cold air rushed past his neck from the shattered doorway. Up close, the damage looked worse. Deep gashes along the ribs where metal had struck, punctures on one leg, a dark matting of fur where blows had landed. Yet beneath the mess, the same stubborn strength he remembered still hummed. He could feel it in the faint push of Rex's chest against his hand when he laid his palm over the dog's side. "What happened?" he asked, voice rough. Ethan swallowed, eyes flicking between James and Rex. "2 guys, masks, crowbars," he replied, words clipped but clear. "They forced the door, went for me, started tearing the place apart. I told them to take whatever they wanted." His gaze dropped to the dog in his arms, and something like a broken laugh caught in his throat. "He wouldn't let them. They went for you," and he stepped in front. James said quietly, not really a question. Ethan nodded, took one in the leg, one in the ribs, hung onto the arm of the first guy until they panicked and ran. "I called it in as soon as they hit the trees, then did what I could." But he hesitated, the medic in him cataloging injuries, the man in him afraid to finish the sentence. James looked down at Rex's face, at the familiar markings around his eyes, at the grey hairs that had begun to frost his muzzle long before retirement forms were signed. Those eyes, now half-lidded, had once blazed with focus in alleys and warehouses. Tonight they seemed to be fighting through layers of fog. Still, when James spoke his name again, softer, the dog's gaze tried to find him. "You saved him," James said, meeting Ethan's stare. "You got between this and worse." Ethan shook his head, rainwater dripping from his hair onto Rex's fur. "No," he answered, voice low but firm. "He saved me. I was ready to let them walk off with everything, maybe do something reckless, and he decided that wasn't happening. I just followed his lead." Outside, more sirens approached, their distant wail winding through the trees, growing louder as backup units and an ambulance pushed up the muddy road. Red and blue light flared across the window, turning the cabin walls into a shifting tapestry of color. Shadows of pines slid along the glass with each flash, like tall guardians standing watch. Inside that pulsing glow, 3 lives hovered in a fragile triangle. The cop who had once walked away because policy told him to. The medic who had vowed never to open his heart to a working dog again. And the wounded canine lying between them, still choosing to protect when every bone and scar begged for rest. James squeezed Rex's shoulder gently, feeling the faint answering twitch. "Listen," he murmured, "not just to the dog, but to anyone whose chest ached watching this scene. If your eyes are burning right now, if your throat feels tight hearing about a hero lying on a cabin floor after doing the job nobody expected him to do again, I want you to type one thing for him. Comment Rex deserves this below. Every word will be like a hand on his collar, a voice saying you see him, you value what he has given, you believe this kind of courage should be honored, not tossed aside at an auction." Let's turn that comment section into a street lined with people cheering as he rides past, a digital parade for a dog who never learned how to quit. Flood it with love, gratitude and second chances, because while the medics are on their way, while we wait to see if this battered body can pull through one more time, your reaction sends a message far beyond this small room. It tells every viewer who ever doubted the worth of an old working animal that stories like Rex's matter. The ending is not about pain, it is about healing, recognition, and a moment that will stitch together everything broken in this journey. Stay with. The next chapter will show you what this dog earns for that blood on the floor. 1 week after the storm, the city felt different to Rex, even though he had patrolled these streets for years in another life. He rode in the back of a dark SUV with the windows cracked, just enough for cool air to bring in the mixed smells of exhaust, street food and crowded sidewalks. A folded blanket cushioned the floor so his injured leg could rest, and a fresh bandage wrapped his side where purple bruises still faded under his fur. Each bump in the road sent a dull ache through his body, yet his gaze stayed clear, alert, curious. Ahead, the downtown towers rose out of morning haze, glass catching pale sunlight, flags along the avenue snapping above a line of police cruisers and news vans already gathered outside City Hall. Over the past few days, footage from the cabin had circled through every local station, shaky video of a limping German shepherd driving armed intruders away, still frames of blood on wooden planks, interview clips of a medic describing how a dog refused to let go even while taking hits that would drop most animals. Headlines repeated one simple idea in different ways. $30 dog stops armed robbery. Discarded canine saves new owner. Retired police dog proves he still has it. Comment threads filled with outrage about auctions and policy, mixed with gratitude that this particular animal had not been left to fade out unseen. Under all the noise, one truth stood solid. A dog that paperwork listed as surplus had risked his life again without a command. City Hall and the department that once let him go could not pretend that did not matter. So on a bright morning that smelled of coffee, wet sidewalks and early traffic, a red carpet stretched from the base of the steps to the main doors of the old stone building. Cameras lined the entrance behind yellow rope. Microphones waited on thin stands. An honor guard of officers in pressed uniforms formed two rows, white gloves bright against navy sleeves, polished badges shining under the clear sky. The SUV rolled to a stop near the curb. Ethan stepped out first, smoothing a jacket someone from the department had insisted he borrow, his movements cautious around ribs that still carried deep bruises. The tired distance that had lived in his eyes for years looked softer now, replaced by a quiet, stunned kind of pride. A canine handler opened the rear hatch and set a narrow ramp in place. Rex adjusted his weight, paws finding the metal surface. He eased down carefully, one step at a time, bad leg trembling slightly yet holding. As soon as he reached the pavement, a ripple of sound moved through the waiting crowd. People clapped without being told. Children near the front pointed, tugging at sleeves. "There he is," one whispered. "The $30 dog." Rex paused for a breath, nostrils flaring as he took in the scene. He smelled camera batteries, cheap perfume, fresh paper programs, and beneath all that, something sharp and familiar that cut straight through the clutter. James Carter stood partway down the steps, uniform crisp, hat tucked under one arm. His posture, usually guarded, had a softness to it now, the stiffness in his shoulders eased by the sight in front of him. When Rex's eyes found him, the years between their last patrol and this moment snapped together like magnet. The German shepherd moved forward with a new surge of energy, tail swinging in a wide, easy arc. When he reached the base of the stairs, he bumped his head against James's knee with a solid thud. The old greeting that had once started every shift. James's throat tightened so much he had to swallow twice before words would form. He crouched down, ignoring the burst of shutters around them, and slid his fingers into the familiar fur behind Rex's ears. "You look good," he murmured, voice low enough that the microphones could not steal it. "Heard you decided retirement wasn't your thing." Rex released a short huff that almost sounded like an answer, and leaned harder into the touch. Above them, the chief cleared his throat gently near the podium, a signal that the ceremony had to begin. James rose, wiping quickly at one eye before anyone could pretend not to notice. Ethan moved to Rex's left side, resting a hand just above the dog's shoulder, feeling steady muscle under healing skin. Together they walked up the carpet, guided to a place directly in front of the microphones, with officers lined to either side like a corridor of blue. Rex stood between the two men, front paws planted, head high, tail relaxed yet ready to sweep again whenever the air shifted. The chief stepped to the podium. His voice, carried through speakers, filled the plaza. He spoke about the night rain had cut the power to a small cabin, about a break-in that could have ended with a medic alone against two armed intruders, and about a retired K9 who had placed himself in the center of that danger without hesitation. He did not hide earlier decisions. He admitted that policy had labeled this dog as surplus equipment, sold off at a fraction of his training value, then paused as a murmur ran through the assembled crowd. He described how 3 nights later that same lot number had stood his ground against crowbars and boots to defend the very person who had chosen him when no one else raised a hand. Officers scattered among the onlookers listened with expressions that mixed shame, respect, and something like relief. Each time the chief said Rex's name, applause rose, unprompted. The dog's ears flicked at the sound, as though some part of him still expected a command to follow. At last the chief left the microphone and turned toward a small table, where a velvet box rested beside the city seal. He opened it and lifted out a round medal hanging from a blue and gold ribbon, metal catching the light. Engraved words circled the edge, "For courage beyond duty." A hush fell as he stepped away from the stand and approached the German shepherd. Rex did not move. His gaze followed the older man with calm interest, body steady despite the faint tremor in his leg. The chief lowered himself slightly, so he would not tower over the dog, then slipped the ribbon gently over the thick neck, careful of the still tender areas near the bandages. The medal settled against Rex's chest with a small, clear tap. "For courage beyond duty," the chief said, speaking not only to the animal before him, but to everyone gathered on the plaza and watching through screens. "For loyal service on the street, and for a quiet act of bravery in a cabin far from any official shift, given when you owed no one anything." The applause that followed rolled like thunder, not forced, not polite, but full and human. People rose onto their toes, clapping until their hands hurt. In that sound, Rex found his place again, standing between Ethan and James, while the city finally honored his courage and endless heartbeat. This is Rex, asleep by the fire while the last pieces of ash rise and fade, the medal on his chest catching stray light with every slow breath he takes, a small circle of metal that tried to measure something far bigger than words ever could. A week ago, he stood under a harsh beam in a dusty hall, labeled as surplus, reduced to a number that barely covered a dinner, watched by people who saw a limp instead of a lifetime of service. And now the room around him glows warm. The danger is past, the cabin is quiet, and for the first time in years, he is not waiting for a call that might never come. From auction block to hero's welcome, from a lonely concrete floor to a red carpet lined with officers and cameras, he walked every step on battered paws, driven by the same stubborn instinct that pulled him through alleys, warehouses, storms, and one last brutal fight in the dark woods, when nobody would have blamed him for staying down. $30 changed hands that night, but what came home with Ethan was never cheap. It was a heart that refused to understand the word surplus, a soldier spirit that did not recognize retirement papers, a partner's loyalty looking for one more person to protect. He never stopped being a guardian, never stopped listening for trouble in the wind, never stopped watching doorways. He simply lost the uniform and found a different kind of duty. The quiet mission of reminding anyone who hears his story that true worth is not decided by price tags, age, scars, or policies typed in some far office. Look at him now, curled in front of the fire with that medal resting against his chest, eyes closed, paws relaxed, body finally allowed to heal. Every mark in his fur is a line in a history book written in actions, instead of ink, and tonight he gets to rest, knowing that the people who almost walked away now understand what they nearly threw aside. If this journey has moved something inside you, if you felt your chest tighten when he stood alone in that auction hall, if you held your breath when the door to the cabin exploded inward, if you blinked back tears when sirens painted the trees and two men knelt beside one wounded dog on a wooden floor, then do 3 simple things right now before the screen goes dark. Hit like with more force than you used on any other video today, not as a habit but as a small digital salute to a working animal who gave everything twice, once for a badge and once for a stranger who refused to see him as broken. Every tap tells the algorithm that stories about loyal sacrifice and second chances deserve to be shown instead of buried. Second, subscribe and turn on the bell, because this is not the last time we are going to sit together by this fire and talk about heroes with fur, boots, uniforms, or no titles at all. Part 2 of Rex's journey, the quieter day, the challenges of healing, and the unseen battles many retired service animals and veterans fight every single morning, is coming next week, and you do not want to miss the chance to walk beside them. Drop a comment with a simple question answered from your heart. Would you adopt a retired K9? Yes or no? And if your answer is yes, tell us why. Maybe you grew up near a base. Maybe an officer once brought a dog to your school. Maybe you just feel something pull at you when you see gray around a muzzle. But write it down and let the world see how many people still care. When you finish, send this video to one person who needs to be reminded that being tossed aside by a system, a job, a relation, or a bad chapter does not mean the story is over. Someone out there thinks they are too damaged, too old, too late, and watching a so-called discarded K9 stand up when it mattered might be the spark that gets them through one more night. Because second chances are not only for dogs or officers or medics, they are for anyone who has ever stared at a closed door and believed that was the final word. Anyone who has been labeled as less than by people who never saw the whole picture. Anyone who has scars that make them think they have nothing left to offer. Rex went from being priced like a piece of used equipment to standing between the man who first trained him and the man who took him home, tail gently wagging while the city applauded. And if that transformation does not prove that worth can be rediscovered, nothing will. So as the camera slowly pulls back and the piano fades, remember this scene: a dog with a limp sleeping in peace, a medal catching firelight, rain finally quiet outside, and two chairs close by where James and Ethan can sit and know they did not let him face the end alone. His story in this chapter has come to a close, but yours is still wide open, full of choices you have not made yet, people you have not helped yet, courage you have not tested yet. Carry Rex with you into whatever comes next, and every time you feel written off or underestimate, hear that soft clink of metal and that steady breathing by the fire, and know that no hero is ever truly broken. They are just waiting for the right moment, the right mission, the right hand reaching out. We will see you in the next